Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible, by Chanan Tigay, narrated by Chanan Tigay. Prologue. A Famous Corpse. The Netherlands. Sunday, March 9th, 1884, began as a slow news day at police headquarters in Rotterdam. At 10:30, Catharina Johanna van Vliet arrived in a huff after her brother-in-law spent the morning calling her names. At 1 o'clock, 2 patrolmen attempted to detain a drunken German. With 6 o'clock came a break in the case of some stolen sausages. Officers A. Vandermeulen and L.J.A. Hoogland had collared a suspect on the Westplein. The arrest came too late to save the sausages, but the constable's work was considered so exemplary that each was slated for a bonus. It was right around this time that the station received a concerned dispatch from a seedy hotel called the Wilhelmsbrug. 2 days earlier, one of its guests had entered his room and locked the door, and hadn't been heard from since. Adjunct Inspector G. Putman Kramer was sent to investigate. Arriving at number 6 Boompjes Street, situated on a block of brick buildings that housed a bank, a life insurer, and a zinc merchant, Kramer approached the room in question and broke through the door. He entered to a grisly scene. Slumped on the bed was the bloodied corpse of a middle-aged man, a bullet hole notched in his head. Beside the bed lay the man's suitcase. It was stuffed with manuscripts, some new, some ancient, written in English and Hebrew among other languages. Nearby was a stack of business cards. Kramer slipped one from the pile and took down its inscription. M.W. Shapira, bookseller and antiquarian, agent of the British Museum, Jerusalem. That evening's police register logs the death, noting the name of the deceased but offering no indication that authorities knew they had a world-famous corpse on their hands, that months earlier this brilliant man had been a household name, meeting with England's prime minister and its intellectual elite, making daily appearances in European gossip columns, staying in fancy hotels as he prepared to become exceedingly rich. The guest in question appears to be named M.W. Shapira, the duty officer reported. After having been viewed by Dr. C.H. Eshuis, he was taken to the morgue. Just beneath this, the night's final entry. There is nothing to report about garbage. It took 3 days, but the press eventually figured out who the dead man was. A short item in the March 12th edition of the Liedisch Dagblad noted that this is probably the person who became disreputable last year in England for his falsified manuscripts. Not quite the epitaph M.W. Shapira had been hoping for. 8 months earlier, when he arrived at the London doorstep of Sir Walter Besant, longtime secretary of the Palestine Exploration Fund, Moses Wilhelm Shapira, archaeological treasure hunter, antiquities maven, inveterate social climber, and, by that point, a man painfully down on his luck, believed that the contents of the stylish carpetbag he carried would help repair a once solid reputation that had nearly been destroyed by scandal. At home in Jerusalem, Shapira's wife and daughters awaited news of his mission. If all went according to plan, they would soon rank among the Holy City's wealthiest inhabitants, assuming a place in its social hierarchy that the 54-year-old Shapira had been clawing for ever since he bolted Eastern Europe 3 decades earlier in search of his absent father and his fortune. That July morning, Shapira, a little bit Indiana Jones, a little Jay Gatsby, had appeared at Besant's, claiming to have in his possession an ancient manuscript that would simply make students of the Bible and Hebrew scholars reconsider their ways. It was a bold claim, redolent of a magician's patter, and while Shapira's performance intrigued Besant, he also found the whole thing a little annoying. The Brit was entirely familiar with the bearded, bespectacled foreigner standing before him now. The previous year, Shapira had played a small, unsuccessful part in an attempt to rescue one of the Palestine Exploration Fund's Orientalist explorers, when the man, Edward Henry Palmer, was kidnapped by Bedouin brigands during a reconnaissance mission in Egypt. The fund had paid Shapira £8 and change for his efforts. Palmer had not fared so well. Soon after his capture, the Bedouin had slaughtered him, tossing his body off a cliff to be feasted on by birds. Besant also knew Shapira as one of the British Museum's most important purveyors of centuries-old Hebrew manuscripts. Over the prior 6 years, Shapira had collected a vast stockpile of these valuable books and scrolls from communities throughout the Middle East. Some of them dated back as far as 700 years. The museum had paid handsomely to add these manuscripts to its own collection, as had other such institutions around Europe, a fact that imbued Shapira's stagey pronouncement with the aura of authenticity. Archaeology in the late 19th century was a popular pastime among Western elites, and, as Shapira approached Besant, the field was still emerging from the domain of gentlemanly adventure into one governed by tenets of science. The British were engaged in a drawn-out rivalry with Germany and France, not only for colonial dominance but for international prestige. Archaeological prowess, manifested by the display of looted relics in the gilded galleries of their national museums, offered an express passage to glory. After its discovery by French soldiers near the mouth of the Nile, England had managed to secure what became known as the Rosetta Stone for the British Museum, opening the way for scholars to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. When an Anglican missionary found the Moabite stone, its inscription offering the first confirmation of a biblical story outside the Bible itself, the French snatched it up, depositing the 2,700-year-old basalt monument in the Louvre for all the world to ogle. The Germans, however, had yet to acquire relics of such magnitude for their royal museum. Indeed, efforts to keep pace with their European adversaries had recently ended in humiliation. That debacle began in 1872, when Shapira, himself an occasional Anglican missionary, came into possession of nearly 2,000 ancient clay vessels and statuettes, allegedly discovered in the biblical region of Moab, just east of the Dead Sea. Many of these items were engraved in an ancient script similar to the one found on the Moabite stone, which told the story of King Mesha's blood-soaked rebellion against the Israelites. Others coarsely depicted nude women with genitalia that appeared to have been fashioned by the swing of a battle axe. Eager for a big win after losing Mesha's stele to Paris, the Prussians had gone all in, purchasing Shapira's collection for 20,000 thaler. Much as his sale of the Hebrew manuscripts would boost the reputation of the British Museum, Shapira's pottery had buoyed Prussia. But when the artifacts were dismissed as clumsy forgeries, the fallout came as a great embarrassment to the Germans. Shapira had been laboring ever since to repair his reputation. Despite recent success as an agent to the Brits, he remained unable to entirely shake the taint of disgrace. The man was a good actor, Besant recalled some years later. He was a man of handsome presence, tall, with fair hair and blue eyes, not the least like the ordinary Polish Jew, and with an air of modest honesty which carried one away. Besant's reference to the religion of Shapira's birth raises questions about the true nature of his misgivings. Nor did Shapira's rendition of the events leading to his visit smooth Besant's hackles. Beyond claiming that his discovery would change the world's conception of the Bible, he would divulge nothing about the purpose of his visit. Unconvinced that the handsome man standing before him was anything more than a charlatan, Besant suggested that if Shapira was unwilling to disclose exactly what he was hiding in his bag, he should simply go away. Faced with Besant's ultimatum, Shapira relented, uncorking a few details about his find. The scrolls, Besant would recall Shapira saying, contained a copy of Deuteronomy, the fifth and final of the 5 books of Moses, remarkable for its seminal role in formulating monotheism, but best known for what is embedded in chapter 5, the 10 Commandments. Only this was no common manuscript. This was the original thing, the closing book of the Torah, handwritten more than 3,000 years earlier at the very time the events it described were taking place. It was nothing less than a contemporary copy of the book of Deuteronomy written on parchment, Besant said. A contemporary copy. Stunned, Besant asked if he could see it. Shapira obliged, pulling from his bag a narrow strip of leather tattooed in ancient script. It was written in fine black ink as fresh after 3,000 years as when it was laid on, Besant reported, and in the Phoenician characters of the Moabite stone. This last bit hinted at the fragment's great antiquity, and led Besant to assign the scrolls a date far earlier than any biblical manuscript then known to have existed. This ordinary day had just become quite extraordinary. If these leather slips truly constituted a contemporary copy of Deuteronomy, then Shapira could stop acting. He had just uncovered the oldest Bible on earth. Gathering himself, Besant suggested that his guest make this discovery known to the world. Shapira, still coy, was not yet ready to go public with his find. But after a subsequent meeting, Besant said, he agreed to show it to 2 people. One was C.D. Ginsburg, among the great Bible scholars of the day, and an acknowledged expert on the Moabite stone, whom Shapira had encountered more than a decade earlier in Jerusalem. The second man Shapira agreed to see was Claude Conder, an officer of the British military whose survey work for the Palestine Exploration Fund, PEF, had helped lay the groundwork for a more scientific approach to archaeology in that region. Conder had worked in Moab and published on matters of the Bible's geography. More recently, his name has been floated as a possible Jack the Ripper. A meeting was set, invitations were dispatched, and Shapira repaired to his room in the Cannon Street Hotel. There was nothing for him to do but wait. Interpreting the summons as an occasion to gather his friends, Ginsberg arrived the following night at the PEF's Adam Street headquarters, along with the whole of the British Museum and all the Hebrew scholars in London, Besant recalled. The scene was striking. A host of the country's top Hebrew and Bible savants, as they were known, assembled in a single room to await the unveiling of their visitor's secret hall. Even the hour was charged. Besant had called the meeting for the stroke of midnight. Shapira, moreover, was said to be asking an astounding £1 million sterling for the strips, about $250 million today. By comparison, in the previous decade the Louvre had purchased the Moabite stone for what now seemed a pittance of just 15,000 francs, about $60,000 now. But £1 million? That figure made even these sober professors, PEF executives, and British Museum specialists straighten their well-earned scholarly stoops. As they milled about, Besant would recount, excitement charged the room such as is very seldom exhibited by scholars. Finally, like a conductor waiting to unleash his orchestra on a hushed symphony hall, Shapira sensed his moment had arrived. Reaching into his bag, he removed 15 leather strips, dappled and blackened with age. Most were about 7 inches long and 3.5 inches wide. A few were somewhat smaller. Foregoing the reverence with which one would expect the owner of such valuable antiquities to behave, Shapira, ever the showman, took the darkened leathers and tossed them jauntily on the table. These strips, Shapira announced, contained 3 copies of Deuteronomy, in which Moses delivered his valedictory speech to the children of Israel on the plains of Moab. But this was not the Deuteronomy these scholars knew. It was much shorter, and was rife with passages that were different, sometimes very different, from the traditional version. And here was the kicker. Judging from the ancient Hebrew script, then also called Phoenician, the scrolls could have been written closer to the time of Moses than any other known manuscript. The scholars immediately understood the enormous import of the discovery. Beyond their monetary value, the scrolls could take 3,000 years of religious faith and turn them upside down. If they were real, the scrolls offered evidence that the Bible, then used in synagogues and churches the world over, was not the version handed by Moses to the children of Israel just before they crossed into Canaan. Rather, the so-called Masoretic or traditional text with which the world was familiar was a newer and longer version, based on the one Shapira now displayed, but altered and edited by human hands over the course of centuries. Shapira's arrival with this manuscript could not have been better timed. Britain was just then in the throes of a Bible craze, captivated by a cadre of Protestant theologians who questioned the divine authorship of the Bible. Applying critical theory to the Holy Book, a number of these prominent thinkers claimed that several books of the Old Testament had begun as shorter documents, added to by multiple authors over the years. As for the Torah, some scholars surmised that editors had gathered 4 separate texts and melded them into the official narrative. The very year Shapira came to London, Julius Wellhausen, father of this documentary hypothesis, published his definitive volume on the matter, making his case so powerfully that it had snared the attention of British scholars and laymen alike. Now here was Shapira and his swanky bag, and in it what appeared to be the original article, furnishing proof for some of these theories, and evidence that others of them were mistaken. To many minds, the notion that the Torah as read in modern times was not in fact the same book God had originally dictated was a jarring, even blasphemous proposition. After all, such thinking implied that human beings had, at the very least, played a significant role in creating the Bible. And if that were the case, perhaps the Holy Book was not quite so holy. Perhaps its stories and its laws were not immutable. Perhaps questions could now be raised about which portions of the Bible were divine and which were not, and perhaps those deemed to have originated with man could now be ignored. The implications were profound, unfathomably so. A few years earlier, the influential Scottish theologian William Robertson Smith had been tried for heresy when he wrote an encyclopedia article raising similar questions about the Bible's origins. Smith's trial had enthralled the British public and offered many an education in the critical approach to the Bible. Among 8 counts originally leveled against him, the single charge that survived as the marathon case plodded forward took aim at Smith's theories on Deuteronomy, which he claimed was written long after the death of Moses. Wellhausen too believed this book was a late addition to the Torah. introduced sometime around 622 BCE. But Shapira's scrolls, written in a form of the alphabet used 2 centuries before that, demonstrated that Deuteronomy could have originated with Moses, or at least that it was centuries older than Wellhausen and Smith argued. Whatever these scrolls said about the accuracy of the traditional text, the emotional impact of seeing, touching, and reading from an original copy of the Torah would have been electrifying. So too would be proving the critics wrong. The scholars who had come to see Shapira's manuscript could hardly bridle their elation. "This is one of the few things which could not be a forgery or a fraud," one professor cried out. Shapira reached back into his bag and brought forth several smaller Hebrew manuscript fragments, one of which, reported William Simpson, a sketch artist for the Illustrated London News, was rolled up in a rude way and suggested from its shape and color the unsmoked half of a gigantic cigar, which I suggested must have been left by Og, king of Bashan. Next, Shapira produced a few stone bottles inscribed in ancient Phoenician characters. "I assumed that all these were authentic," Simpson recalled, betraying an early hint of skepticism about the scrolls, and were meant to give an air of reality to the whole. Simpson was right about one thing. The cigar-like fragment and the stone bottles were mere accessories. Shapira's 15 leather strips were the stars of his show. As the scholars eyed them, though, they found it rather difficult to make any confident determination about their origin or content. In spite of Besant's recollections, the fragments were largely dark, very dark, and whatever writing was etched on their surface had been clouded by the years. Shapira claimed to be familiar with the problem. He'd faced the same issue 5 years earlier, he said, when a Bedouin felon had first delivered the scrolls on Jerusalem's desolate outskirts. Now, as the scholars puzzled over the mysterious manuscript, Shapira pulled yet another item from his bag, a bottle of spirits. He poured it on the old leathers, rubbing the liquid brusquely over their surface with a small brush. Suddenly, acted on by the alcohol, the writing emerged with greater clarity. The effect was wondrous and shocking. Simpson described it as a sight to make one shiver. As the men examined the documents, one put a question to Shapira about the nature of the leather. Shapira reached for one of the strips, tore off a fragment about an inch in diameter, and held it out for him to examine. "This he really did to a document he declared to be as old as 900 BC, Simpson recalled. McMullen was standing beside me, and I whispered in his ear, 'See, there is a precious fragment worth at least 500 pounds torn off.'" As Simpson's aside landed, someone knocked over the spirits which spilled onto the manuscript. It was dazzling theater, exciting and odd and a little bit dangerous. Over the course of years as the proprietor of an antiquities shop in Jerusalem, Shapira had developed a salesman's knack for closing a deal, and a riverboat gambler's stomach for risk. Still, it was baffling behavior from a man asking £1 million for his find. Perhaps he felt the dramatic appeal of the gesture was greater than the damage it would cause. Or maybe he was so certain of his discovery's value that he felt nothing could diminish it. Either way, the 3-hour meeting was an unmitigated success. London's top specialists departed impressed and energized. The British Museum was now officially interested in obtaining the fragments, and Shapira's reputation was buttressed, completing a remarkable shift for the émigré, who a decade earlier had been famous chiefly as the face of an archaeological scandal. News of his discovery would shortly leak to the press, making its way through Europe and across the Atlantic to the United States. For a short time in that exhilarating summer of 1883, Shapira would become, at last, world famous. In the meantime, there was work to be done. The text had to be transcribed and translated, interpreted, and assigned a date. The savants elected Ginsberg for the job, and he hurried the scrolls to the British Museum to begin work at once. As the scholars filed out of the PEF headquarters that night, one particularly excitable fellow noted that Shapira's manuscript was a remarkable illustration of the arts as known and practiced in the time of Moses. Perhaps. But within 8 months, another Moses Wilhelm Shapira, would be dead. His name would be sullied both in the halls of European power and at home in Jerusalem. His scrolls would be publicly shot down as forgeries, and then, as though ashamed to be seen, they would vanish. 1. From Philadelphia to Jerusalem. I first heard the name Moses Wilhelm Shapira from my father, a rabbi and Bible scholar whose most important work to date is a 600-page commentary on Deuteronomy, the very book that got Shapira into so much trouble. My father spent 16 years honing his analysis and so, like Shapira, understands a good Deuteronomy obsession. On a Friday night in 2010, I was sitting at my family's table finishing up dinner when he launched into the story of a bizarre Bible scroll that had been enveloped in scandal. This was not our standard table talk. True, Deuteronomy usually made an appearance, the Bible, and the languages spoken by the ancient Near Easterners who lived in close proximity to the Israelites, was a fixture of our life. When my dad withdrew cash from an ATM, he'd tell my mother he was getting kaspu. He used this Akkadian word for money so that any lurking thieves wouldn't get wise to his plans. The ruse worked. Apparently very few of Philadelphia's crooks speak Akkadian. Growing up, Friday night dinners were a time of copious food and chaotic revelry, my 3 brothers and I doing our best to make each other laugh, our parents struggling to maintain some sense of decorum. Our behavior was tempered, if only somewhat, by the presence of our frequent guests. When one would pose a question to my father, he would disappear from the table only to return hauling a large stack of books exhumed from his study. 7 hours later, his answer complete, dessert would be served. On this particular Friday night, though, talk turned to a series of articles I had recently written about biblical frauds. A few days earlier, a team of Chinese evangelicals had publicly touted their discovery of Noah's Ark, buried beneath the snows of Turkey's Mount Ararat. The find, if authentic, would have been mind-blowing. To see, touch, and smell the vessel that had saved humankind together, 2 by 2, with the entire animal kingdom, would have represented nothing short of a modern-day miracle. For believers especially, it would have offered proof that the Bible was not simply a compendium of instructive fables, but rather a true account of world history. But there was a problem. The discovery was a hoax. It had taken nearly 5,000 years to unearth the Ark, and just 3 days for the so-called discovery to be debunked. A couple of years earlier, a group of Kurdish laborers, hired by a local guide working with the Chinese expedition, had removed several large wooden beams from an old structure near the Black Sea and dragged them to a cave by the peak of Ararat, long thought by believers to have been the spot where Noah's Ark eventually washed up. When I finished telling this story, my father chimed in with a tale of another biblical scandal. In 1883, he said, a Jerusalem antiquities merchant named Shapira had offered an ancient copy of Deuteronomy to the British Museum for £1 million. That deal had blown up, the scrolls scorned as frauds. Shapira had died soon after, and his scrolls had disappeared. The mystery was intoxicating, and it got better. Shapira's manuscripts, I would soon learn, were strikingly similar to another great desert find that had altered our understanding of the Bible's origins and changed the course of Near Eastern archaeology: the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapira's Deuteronomy was said to have been discovered in a cave. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapira's manuscripts were full of departures from the traditional biblical text. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapira's strips were found by Bedouin wandering the desert near the Dead Sea. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Indeed, their discovery 6 decades after Shapira's death had led some scholars to reopen the investigation of his oddball Deuteronomy, whose dismissal all those years earlier, they now believed, might have been tragically premature. In the winter of 1947, 3 Ta'amira shepherds were grazing goats along the mountainous rim that overlooks the Dead Sea. To pass the time, one of the shepherds tossed rocks toward the mouth of a nearby cave. His aim was good. One sailed right in, and the noise that came back surprised him. It was not the sharp snap of rock on rock or the dull scratch of stone skidding against the cave's dirt floor. Instead, he heard pottery shattering. 2 days later, one of the Bedouin, Muhammad ad-Dib, awoke before his comrades and returned to the cave. Inside, he came upon 10 clay jars. Most were empty. Some, however, held something interesting: old leather scrolls wrapped in linen and black with age. Ad-Dib took his discovery to a Bethlehem antiquities dealer named Khalil Eskander, better known as Kondo. Kondo was impressed and sent the shepherds back into the desert to look for more. When they returned, they had collected a total of 7 scrolls. Kondo bought 4 and, in short order, sold them to Mar Athanasios Samuel, Archbishop of St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox Monastery in Jerusalem. The Bedouins sold the remaining 3 scrolls to another Arab antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. Meanwhile, Eliezer Sukenik, a respected archaeologist at the Hebrew University, learned of the scrolls' existence. The Arab-Israeli violence that would shortly culminate in the bloody War of Independence, known among Palestinians as the Catastrophe, rendered a trip to the dealer's place treacherous. But the lure of these ancient scrolls was too great for Sukenik. Risking injury, even death, he arranged a secret rendezvous with another antiquities dealer at the city's military zone, where rolls of coiled concertina wire lay like infernal tumbleweed in the street separating Jerusalem's Arabs and Jews. On the opposite side of a barbed wire fence, the antiquities merchant displayed a fragment of the scrolls. Sukenik was captivated. Casting caution aside, he hustled to Bethlehem to get his first good look at what would soon become known worldwide as the Dead Sea Scrolls. My hands shook as I started to unwrap one of them, he wrote that day in his diary. I read a few sentences. It was written in beautiful biblical Hebrew. The language was like that of the Psalms, but the text was unknown to me. I looked, and I suddenly had the feeling that I was privileged by destiny to gaze upon a Hebrew scroll which had not been read for more than 2,000 years. Sukenik purchased the 3 manuscripts, the Thanksgiving Scroll, the War Scroll, and a copy of Isaiah. And as violence spun out unabated, Mar Samuel secreted his 4 scrolls to the relative safety of New Jersey. There, on June 1, 1954, he placed an ad in the Wall Street Journal. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Sukenik acquired these scrolls too on behalf of the fledgling state of Israel, which built a special wing of its national museum to house them. They called it the Shrine of the Book. Over the next several years, scholars and Bedouins searched in the heat of the Judean desert, competing to find as many of these valuable scrolls as they could. What they found fell into 2 major categories. First were ancient copies of the 24 books that made up the Bible, older by some 1,000 years than nearly all other known manuscripts. Suddenly, scholars, believers, and others with even a tangential interest in Scripture could see what the text of the Bible had looked like 10 centuries earlier, and how it had developed in the intervening years. The second category became known as sectarian literature, documents written by and for the sect of ancients who lived at Qumran, site of the discovery. In the days leading up to Christianity's birth, multiple Jewish factions emerged in the Holy Land. Judaism as we know it developed from a group known as the Pharisees. Other sects, like the Sadducees and the Essenes, who were later identified as the Qumran community, petered out after the Romans sacked the Second Temple in 70 CE. It was from this fluid milieu that Christianity evolved, and some thought the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were the very first Christians. Much of the world sang hallelujahs. Major newspapers gave the discoveries front-page treatment. Magazine writers pondered the scroll's origins and implications. But, as in Shapira's day, there were doubters. And their arguments were similar to those eventually advanced about Shapira's scrolls. Prominent among the Dead Sea Scrolls detractors was Dr. Solomon Zeitlin, a professor of rabbinic literature at Dropsy College in Philadelphia. Zeitlin took up his cause with gusto, publishing a series of long articles in a journal of which he happened to be the editor, insisting that the manuscripts were not an important discovery, but possibly a hoax. Part of the problem, Zeitlin said, was that the Dead Sea Scrolls used words that didn't find their way into the Hebrew language until centuries after many scholars were claiming the scrolls had been composed. Imagine finding a copy of the Odyssey in which Odysseus makes his marathon journey home aboard a groovy ship, and you'll have a sense of what Zeitlin was arguing. Beyond that, he took issue with the story of the scroll's discovery, pointing out what he believed to be inconsistencies and criticizing one scholar for accepting at face value the word of any Bedouin or Oriental merchant. What really happened, Zeitlin suggested, was that these Bedouin, or some other merchants, had gotten hold of manuscripts that had been removed from synagogues in Cairo, Hebron, or Jerusalem, and planted them in the Qumran caves for theatrical effect. Zeitlin was wrong. In the years after the scrolls were discovered, international scholars subjected them to rigorous analysis, from comparative literary, archaeological, and paleographical examinations to accelerator mass spectrometry techniques that did not yet exist in Shapira's day, and discovered that the scrolls were inarguably real and immeasurably significant. As recently as the 1990s, scientific tests reconfirmed the scroll's antiquity. Today, no serious scholar doubts their authenticity. I was hooked on Shapira that first night at dinner, and started to investigate further. The more I learned, the more I began to share the suspicions of a small group of scholars who believed Shapira might have stumbled onto the first Dead Sea Scroll 70 years before Muhammad Adib clambered into that cave in Qumran. Had this once impoverished immigrant, I wondered, made one of the most important archaeological finds of his generation, only to be pushed toward death by those who simply wouldn't allow themselves to believe it was real? Had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls vindicated the disgraced Shapira? Would his scrolls, had they come to light after...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?